I imagine I am off because I hope we're off. Yes, exactly.
Global Perspectives lecture series. I'm Rudy Hernandez. I looked at the paper for that. And I teach constitutional democracy and political science here at Mizzou. I also direct our Constitutional Democracy Academy. If you have a rising high school junior or a rising high school senior in your life, please encourage them to apply to our Constitutional Democracy Academy and spend a week with us studying the American founding. Tonight marks our third Global Perspective lecture featuring a view from Mexico. It actually says on here, Rudy, that's Mexico the country, not Mexico, Missouri. At the Kinder Institute, we spent the past decade teaching, researching, and writing about the early American founding and its continued impact today. This series is a special part of our work commemorating the nation's 250th anniversary. 250 years ago, they did not have cell phones. And I'm now going to ask you to please silence your cell phones for this lecture. Thank you for joining us, and thanks as well to our partners at the State Historical Society of Missouri for sponsoring this series. We hope to see you again next week when we welcome Eliza Reed, international best-selling author and former First Lady of Iceland, right here at 5 p.m. To begin tonight's program, I'd like to introduce Liam Arnson. Liam is a graduate student in our Master of Arts in Atlantic History and Politics program. When reflecting on this series, Liam emphasized how globalization and interconnection shape our understanding of history, something we'll certainly hear more about tonight. Please join me in welcoming Liam.
They really don't tell you how bright these lights are. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hernandez, and welcome again, everyone, to the second installment of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy's Spring Lecture Series, America at 250. 2 weeks ago, our commemoration of the United States semi-quincentennial, say that 5 times fast. Yes, 2 weeks ago, our commemoration of the United States semi-quincentennial from a global perspective embarked from the European continent and ventured so far as to the land down under. Today, this journey brings us considerably closer to home. Situated below our nearly 2,000-long southern border, this evening's presenter will explore what she describes as our strange relationship with Mexico. Marked by centuries of great exchange, rivalry, cooperation, conflict, and indeed asymmetry, tonight's lecture will ask us to reconsider what it means to celebrate and reflect on our milestone birthday by placing that milestone alongside a neighboring republic whose history has become inseparable from our own. So too will it encourage our consideration of the place the United States has taken within the minds of Mexican citizens throughout the decades, a place which can be characterized as model-worthy, yet threatening, fraternal and cooperative, yet antagonistic, and destination-inclined. In order to facilitate our better understanding of this complex and evolving historical relationship, we are fortunate tonight to be joined by Dr. Erica Pani. Dr. Pani is research professor at El Colegio de México Centro de Estudios Históricos, where she received her PhD in history in 1998. Her expertise lies in 19th century Mexican history, where she's written an expanding corpus of comparative and transnational histories, such as her most recent work, Torn Asunder. Dr. Pani's work has been widely praised and has been recognized with numerous distinctions. Truly, there are few scholars better suited to discuss this evening's subject. Following the presentation, Dr. Jared Roll, Kinder Institute's professor of Missouri history, will join Dr. Pani for a discussion. If you would like to submit any questions, please use the QR code on your program. Now then, ladies and gentlemen, please assist me in welcoming Dr. Erica Pani.
Thank you so much, Liam, for this wonderful introduction. And thanks to everyone who worked very hard to get me up to Mizzou. I am delighted to be in Columbia. And I would also like to thank especially Jay Sexton, who I met a while ago when he was a teenager and had only published 2 of his books. So it's great to see him now as the head of this amazing project, which is the Kinder Institute. and for inviting me to participate in this very exciting idea of thinking about the history of the US on its 250th anniversary from beyond its borders, and in this case, from this perspective of its rather peculiar next door neighbor. Jay said that you would be interested in knowing where my connection with the US came from. So I am a product of more than 150 years of people crossing into the US, crossing the US-Mexico border. No, this long border, as Liam has told us, which is on the one hand the product of war, but also the product of collaboration between US and Mexican surveyors who worked together to trace it. That was adjusted by both cessions and a land sale, and is one of the most crossed over borders in history, and also one of the most stable in modern history. So in 1943, a 22-year-old Evanston, Illinois native went south to Mexico to learn Spanish. She there fell in love with the country and with a man, not with the Spanish language, which she could not handle the gendered nature of things, and kept calling El Ventana and La Coche, but married, raised a family, and lived there until she passed away at 94. Sorry. So there she is. I was also amazingly lucky to be able to go to college in the US, which was an amazing experience. So I had a grandmother whose can-do attitude and optimism was so unflappable that it was almost annoying. And we always decided that this trait was because she was a gringa and not a fatalist Mexican. So as you can imagine, I have a lot of reasons to love this country. But leaving the personal aside, which is what historians are supposed to do, what matters in the US matters very much to me and to most Mexicans. And I am privileged to be able to share this history of connections with you this afternoon. When I get asked about the nature of US-Mexican relations and how they have developed across time, I usually go to historians' very accurate, but ultimately not very useful description of almost all that interests us in the past. It is very complicated. It is also unavoidable. Mexicans and Americans cannot get a divorce. We are destined to live together. And it is very important. Perhaps it is more obvious to Mexicans, but it is also very important to the US. It is a relationship shaped by the more or less stable structural factors of geography, of asymmetry, of power, of cultural differences. But it is also part of history. It has changed over time. It is the result of circumstance, of contingency, and of human interaction. To give you an idea of this complexion, we can go of this complexity. We can go back to the founding moment, which I am not a fan of thinking that the founding defines the rest of what happens afterwards, but I think it is illustrative. It is unclear when this relationship starts. In 1922, Manuel Sosaya, minister of the First Mexican Empire, is sent to Washington to present his credentials and is received by President Monroe. So you have Manuel Sosaya on your left. And on the US envoy to Mexico, who you can see on your right, is Joel R. Poinsett, who arrives in Mexico City on the very same year, but he is not formally accredited until 1825. He is described as a spy, as an agitator, as a schemer. but also as the most important defender of freedom, as Mexico's greatest friend, especially of its popular and American party. He will eventually be deemed persona non grata and asked to leave Mexico City in 1829 without having secured the treaty he was sent to conclude. There are a bunch of sticking points into what points it needs to do. One of them is the sale of land. He wants Texas to be sold to the US, and Mexican authorities to hand over runaway slaves, which Mexican authorities will consistently refuse to do. Sosaya, although more successful in his diplomatic endeavors, will nevertheless write to the emperor, Agustín de Iturbide, with great pessimism. In December of 1822, he says, I quote, "The arrogance of these Republicans does not allow them to see us as equals. They dearly love our money, but not us. They will in time become our sworn enemies," end of quote. So the relationship between the US and Mexico is not determined by ideological distance or closeness, but by circumstance, and especially by what is at the center of the US foreign policy agenda. So this is between neighbors, always a complicated agenda with a lot of different things, but the priority of the US changes, and that is what determines, I think, the tone and the content of the relationship. It began with the US wanting Mexican territory, which, as you can imagine, made things a little difficult, up to the US Civil War. After that, it is trade and investment, which occupies the center of the agenda, and perhaps from the 1910, the decade of 1910, it's mostly security, no? So what I would like to do with you today is to focus on certain turning points in this long and, once again, complicated history. So US expansionism drives US representatives for decades to seek the cession of territory by hook or by crook. This is obviously very problematic for the Mexican government. It does not go away with ideological sympathy, no, that Sosaya identified as a problem, no, the arrogance of Republicans. When Mexicans become Republicans, they think that the US, the First Republic, the great model to follow, will not strike against a sister republic, and they will be sorely disappointed. There are growing tensions in the relationship. The Texas secession, which is legitimized by US recognition in 1836, and US annexation of Texas in 1845, which is seen by Mexico as an aggression. In 1846, as you know, war breaks out after a border skirmish provoked by Polk, who sends troops to the disputed territory between the Nueces and Bravo rivers. The war does not go well for Mexico. September of 1847, US troops occupy Mexico City. You can see the stars and stripes flying over Mexico's national palace, which is one of those images that kind of stays in the Mexican imaginary for a very long time. The Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty, signed in February of 1848, transfers 529 square miles, over half of Mexico's territory, to the United States. What is perhaps interesting is that the outcome of the war, which is so positive for the US, so disastrous for Mexico, sets both victor and vanquished on a similar road to constitutional crisis, political polarization, and eventually civil war, which breaks out in Mexico in 1858 and in the US in 1861. The US Civil War is a historically dense turning point, which I think throws light on the very entangled nature of US and Mexican history. It's also the period I work on, so like all historians, I think this is a crucial period that everyone should study. Before the war, Mexico is in desperate circumstances, growing tensions among the Mexican political class, and in the midst of these domestic confrontations, the liberals, who identify strongly with the Republican and with the US model of commerce, industry, hard work, individualism, etc., want to work on building a closer relationship to the US. And they will use the language of free trade and of Republican solidarity, which US representatives, the diplomats that get sent to Mexico, tend to be very excited about and echo in the US-Mexican legation, if they are thinking about a protectorate rather than a partnership with a southern neighbor. But land hunger is still central to these efforts, and they think Mexican authorities are desperate enough to give up on land which is supposed to be the sovereign people's patrimony. They are not far, they're not that mistaken, no? So what we see is a lot of treaties that are very favorable to the US that are signed during this period that mortgage land in the northern states that will serve as a guarantee to US credit to Mexico, that give the US free passage on the Tehuantepec isthmus between the Pacific and the Atlantic, and that a treaty that actually transfers the land, the Mesilla Valley, which is today's Arizona, to the US. What tempers expansion in this case is not the refusal of Mexican authorities, but the constitutional mechanics of the US. It is the separation of powers, the need for the Senate to ratify what the executive does, the debates in both Congress and the press, and elections that stay the hand of expansion. So even this Gadsden Purchase of 1854, the US accepts a third of the territory that the Mexican government had initially agreed on. So, which I think shows, no, it's an interesting that it is US politics that kind of saves us from losing more land. The US's collapse into civil war actually enables European powers to reestablish presence in the New World. So Spain will go to the South Pacific and occupy the Chincha Islands, setting up a war between Spain, Peru, and Chile, and occupies Dominicana once again, reestablishes colonial control over half of the island. And the French decide to recover their presence in the continental New World and occupy Mexico to restore monarchy. This is a very complicated moment where you have, in the two neighboring countries, 4 governments at war, trying to navigate internal conflict in the midst of these Atlantic entanglements. So, sorry, this is the, sorry. Okay, so on your left, you have the cartoon in a Mexican newspaper where you have Mexicans fighting each other, the mother of the Mexicans crying over these conflicts, and Napoleon III, Isabel II of Spain, and Queen Victoria ganging up on the poor republic. If this cartoon were to be complete, you would have the US distracted by its own internal conflict, which is what makes this possible. On your left, you have the painting of the Spanish South American South American War. Because of the US's foreign policy priority during the war, which is to keep the great powers of Europe out of its internal conflict, the US will embrace neutrality. Oh, so will the Mexican government, by the way. But what that means is that Mexico's appeals to Republican solidarity, to American solidarity, to the Monroe Doctrine repeatedly, and it's not only the Mexicans, but also the Chileans and the Peruvians, will go unanswered. So what is a Mexican diplomat to do? Matias Romero, who is the Mexican Republic's only accredited diplomat outside of the country. They send diplomat Jesus Terán, who's a diplomat. He gets sent to Europe, but he is never received. So the only diplomat carrying the flag of the Mexican Republic is our man in Washington, Matias Romero, 26. Extremely frustrated with Seward's prudent stance as to not having the Civil War go over the borders of the US. Great connoisseur of US politics. He goes to the opposition to Lincoln's government and especially identifies Republican radicals, including Ulysses S. Grant, and convinces them that Mexico's fight is the US's fight, that the fight against Mexican conservatives, the Mexican Catholic Church, and the French is the same struggle as that of the Union against the Southern slavocracy, and that it is a struggle between tyranny and democracy, a struggle between the past and the future, and that the US and Mexico need to get together and get this done. Once the war, but he inserts information in congressional debates, in the newspapers, and contributes to building up this popular opinion and popular pressure that the US needs to do something to get the French out of Mexico. Once the war is over, Washington will cautiously support Mexican Republicans. So on your left, you have a cartoon in a Mexican conservative newspaper which shows the president of the Republic, Benito Juarez, with Mexico on his back, crossing over the river and offering to sell Mexico to Philip Sheridan, who is in Texas at the beginning of Reconstruction and parades his very numerous, well-armed and disciplined troops so the French can see them and get scared, which they do, and leave guns and ammunition right next to the river where Mexican Republicans can cross over and get to them, which contributes to bringing about the end of the French intervention. And despite the US defense of strict neutrality during the war, which meant, among other things, that the French could buy food and could buy animals, but the Mexicans could not buy weapons. Also, Matias Romero was very frustrated and very upset about this whole thing, but strict neutrality. The fact that they don't diplomatically pressure the French until December of 1865, but the memory that is built, that is constructed about Mexico-US relationships during the war is one of Republican solidarity. It is the script that Matias Romero wrote of what should have been and not what actually happened. And we see, if you have ever seen, there are all these statues of Benito Juarez that have been gifted to San Diego, to Chicago, to Washington, D.C., and this image of the two presidents as being very good friends, which is something that did not happen. Also on your On your right, you have this picture of the two presidents, and behind them, the Mexican and the American good neighbors, good friends. Did the two republics become sister republics then? They did in the discourse of diplomacy, but not in the real relationship. But the acquisition of Mexican territory drops out of the US agenda. Relations between the two nations become normal. Mexico becomes a country like any other. More problematic because it's the neighbor, and instability and poverty are problematic for the US, but they will treat Mexico as they treat other nations. A good example of this is that just like what happened with France and with Great Britain, there are a bunch of problems that are inherited from the Civil War, and they will be resolved by claims commissions, which include Mexicans and Americans, and that will throw out all the exaggerated claims, will assign a monetary value to the other ones, and that will resolve in more or less 3 years problems between the two nations. Thomas Schoonover, who was the great historian of Mexico, has this happy expression of what happened at the end of the war, which is that the US exchanged dollars over dominion. No? They preferred to do good business with Mexico than to take its land. I love the sentence, but this does not happen because the two economies are separated, and they will remain more or less apart until the 1880s, when they will be woven together by the southwestern, the development in the US Southwest and through railroads. So from the 1880s on, we will see these economies coming together and the creation of a labor market in common, which is divided by a borderline, which engenders opportunities and problems, as you are all aware of. The Mexican Revolution, this outbreak of violence that comes in the 1910s in reaction to a political dictatorship, but that very quickly becomes a social movement that demands greater social justice, profound social change, unleashes violence and attacks on US citizens' lives and properties, and Mexico defaults on debt. So this instability takes place in a moment where US foreign policy changes, when the Monroe Doctrine becomes a central part of its agenda, and the Roosevelt corollary changes the sense of the doctrine. So the U.S. will respond to the Mexican Revolution with condemnation, but also by occupying Veracruz in 1914, which is what you see on your left, and after Pancho Villa, one of the revolutionary leaders, crosses over to the US and attacks the small town of Columbus in New Mexico, the punitive expedition will send Jack Pershing, the First World War hero, to kind of ride across the Mexican north, trying to capture Villa and take him to justice. The aftermath of revolution witnesses a very difficult rebuilding of this relationship. These constant financial and diplomatic negotiations, this trying to convince the Americans that the revolutionary principles, although they are very radical, everything that's underground belongs to the nation, the land belongs to the nation, and the nation regulates property, will not affect American interest. Again, they will have to process claims. But one of the things that smooths things over between the the two nations is that Mexico's revolutionary experiment, so 1910 to 1920, you have this violence and this revolutionary constitution, which all in all does not follow the Soviet model. So you have 1917 in Russia, which makes the Mexican Revolution look not that bad. And you do have these actors who are looking to Mexico, moving to Mexico, and thinking that this is something that maybe they could learn about, that could be interesting to take some of these principles and apply them to the States. So you have, on the one hand, a kind of cultural diplomacy that is undertaken by actors who are not state agents, or not always state agents, who are very interested in Mexican art and Mexican folk art especially. And this works very well. It becomes kind of part of the US-Mexico diplomatic script. You have in the lower left-hand corner, Dwight D. Morrow, who was a banker, who is sent to Mexico as ambassador and becomes a great promoter of Mexican art and of Mexican folk art. There he's seen buying some stuff. Josephus Daniels, who was the ambassador, Roosevelt's ambassador to Mexico, who kind of brokered a very prudent response when Mexico nationalized the oil industry in 1938. So he and his wife are dressed in Mexican costumes. And then it's the much more modern picture is Christopher Landau. I'm probably pronouncing his last name wrong, who was Trump's ambassador in the first Trump administration, or who depicts himself in what we call un milagro, a miracle, which are these small paintings that are offered to a saint, to the Virgin of Guadalupe, because she has performed a personal miracle that the person has asked for. So they're given in thanks. It should have been put into the church, but I guess he has it at his house. But we see not only this interest, this soft power, diplomatic, cultural diplomacy, but in these artistic exchanges and intellectual exchanges that have to do with art. So you have, in the 1930s, you have the three big Mexican muralists, David Alfaro Siqueiros, José Clemente Orozco, and Diego Rivera, who are all painting in the States. And as you can see, especially with Siqueiros and Orozco, painting things that are very radical and very dissident and still are found particularly attractive. Rivera was hired by Rockefeller, but then Rockefeller decided that including Lenin and Marx into the murals at the Rockefeller Center, not a good idea, so got rid of them. But it is interesting that they provoked enough interest that they were in the States for years and produced a very fertile exchange with American artists. And then there's this discussion about agrarian policy, the race question, eugenics, that are very education, that are very fertile. Despite the fact that they perhaps kind of freeze the image of Mexico, kind of make it very colorful, very aesthetic, but rather static and perhaps a little flat. 1929 is an inflection point for the U.S.-Mexican relation, as it was for the rest of the world. The transnational dimension of the crisis causes turbulence and uncertainty and impoverishment, but it also sparks innovation and a less self-assured, less aggressive, more cooperative stance from the US. So there's the New Deal internally, and for the rest of the Americas, there is the good neighbor policy. And this idea that the US and Mexico have to walk together towards the future, When World War II breaks out, Mexico joins the Allies, and the Cold War kind of follows the same pattern. No? US security concerns take center stage, and Mexico accepts this and assumes cooperation is an important responsibility. It also exploits it, I would argue, quite productively. No? So Mexico contributes to the war effort. They send 1 battalion to the South Pacific, but also through production, especially of cotton and of opiates, and with controlled migrant labor program, which is the Bracero program, where you can see the workers registering for it on your right. So during the Cold War, following this pattern, in general, Mexico has greater leeway than the rest of Latin America. No, there is collaboration, they share information, intelligence, security concerns, but this allows Mexico to be more autonomous, sometimes even dissident in its position in foreign policy on the global stage. Mexico keeps up its friendly relations with Cuba. We even have a museum of Cuban-Mexican friendship. I don't know if that's going to survive, but it takes in the exiles from the Latin American progressive governments that had to flee their country after military dictatorships were set up. It flirts with the non-aligned movement. It flirts with OPEC always. No, it's an observer. It goes to the meetings. It doesn't really join the organization, but it's there. And that does work for Mexico in widening its space for maneuver. It produces what Mexican diplomats describe as a special relationship. I would say that this is kind of wishful thinking, but it does secure something that I think is less flashy, but perhaps more important. It gives Mexican diplomats the possibility of negotiating different issues. Some, as you know, are very contentious, and to work on them separately, to kind of put them in different categories that don't contaminate each other. So disagreement on one thing does not turn relations upside down. It doesn't paralyze discussion on the many other issues that the two countries need to resolve together. No? So conflict over migration, over drug trafficking, do not prevent agreements going forward on other issues such as water, consular protection, border management, etc. So difficult relationship. It took a lot of work, but it was kept up and did what it needed to do. By the end of the Cold War, the well-known scripts and references begin to fall apart at the seams. Mexico is, at that moment, 1988, is a very contested election. It is widely thought to have been fraudulent and to have put the man who did not win the election in power. So from this deep economic, political legitimacy crisis, Mexico will actually will have a sympathetic year. That's something that's also on the US side, but it will push this creative domestic reforms and seeks to transform the relationship with the US. The result of this will be the free trade agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico, which implied, in the words of one of the Mexican negotiators, the rediscovery of America. No? The discovery of relying on common origins, on common experiences, and especially of facing common challenges together. There are a bunch of problems with the free trade agreement. I would stress the fact that it liberated the movement of goods and capital, but not of people, despite the reality of a common market that's split by a borderline. But it did take politics out of one of the important parts of the relationship, which is trade. So disagreements about trade should go through these protracted technical mechanisms for conflict resolution that are written down on paper. Oh? And this, I think, diffuses disagreements that could escalate and become a greater problem than they are. This contributed to stability and to predictability, which is definitely what you want in an asymmetric relationship with an actor who you are greatly dependent on and who is much less dependent on you. This seems to have pretty much gone out the window in recent years. So I think that the challenge now is, how do we build a new normal? And it's not easy to be optimistic, but I think that we can take solace in history. In the past, crises have spurred interesting innovations, even in the context of this unequal and asymmetric relationship, where we have usually landed on good faith, on reasonable discussion, and things that benefit both sides, if not in the same degree. These solutions have often been promoted by actors on the ground, on both sides of the border, not necessarily the national governments. They have often been unaffiliated with the state. So if I may, I will channel my Pollyanna grandmother from the outskirts of Chicago and trust that we can activate these numerous, dense connections between our two countries and build something better together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica, for that wonderful, sweeping, and deeply insightful talk. Greetings, friends. I am Professor Jared Roll, Professor of Missouri History in the Kinder Institute and the Department of History. It's my pleasure to be interlocuting with Professor Pani this evening with a set of questions that have arrived in advance. And I would just remind you that if you have questions now, please use the QR code on your program to type those, and through the miracle of new technology, they will find their way to this iPad, where I will speak them aloud. Sorry, I'm not used to the Britney Spears microphone.
But we will not dance.
I would like to start with a question from one of our students. How much consensus exists within Mexican society regarding the United States, attitudes toward the United States, either politically or more broadly? You could speak to the present moment, the recent past, or the deeper past.
So, I'm sorry. This is good? Okay. That's an excellent question. I think that if we are to speak about what is going on today, there is not much consensus on anything. But our Mexican citizens' relationship to the U.S. tends to be a little schizophrenic historically. Mexicans think of the U.S. and there is this imagery of, the empire, which is kind of evil, but it is where every Mexican family has someone in the U.S. that is working here and probably sending money back home. Remittances are the largest source of foreign currency in Mexico, more than oil. They have hit in 2024 the largest they have been ever, despite COVID and economic crisis. And so the U.S. is still seen as a threat, but also as a haven, also as a source of opportunities. There was in the 70s the saying where they said, Yankees no, gringas sí. So we don't want, Americans interfering, no, definitely no American soldiers, but we do like American tourists, and we like American women tourists even more. So it is kind of, it's the neighbor you mistrust and you kind of envy, but you would not mind moving in with him or her. So and I think that mixed feelings like this are generalized among Mexican citizens. Mexican citizens on the border who tend to have very close relations with the other side, sometimes family. There, I think it's perhaps even more sympathetic.
Thank you. Amid the complicated history that you've unfurled for us, amid that schizophrenic view toward the United States, I'm wondering, given our theme, what are views toward or thinking about the American founding in particular within Mexico? The extent to which Mexicans are able to separate it from what comes after 1776, or is does what comes after 1776 overshadow and obscure the meaning or the importance of the American founding?
I think that in revolutionary Mexico, and by revolutionary I don't mean the 1910 revolution, but the independence revolution, there is this deep appreciation for the founding, for establishing not only breaking the bonds of empire, but establishing a society based on equality and on freedom, of inventing a republic. You have men, usually men in this time period, going to the U.S., meeting in Philadelphia, meeting other revolutionaries in Philadelphia, getting stuff printed and circulating in the U.S. I think that's one of the reasons why the 1846-48 war is so traumatic for Mexican politicians. Because those who had traveled to the U.S. thought that there is the problem of slavery, which is seen as an aberration. And then it is seen as, because the war is a war of conquest, because it is considered profoundly unfair, and because Mexicans lose the war, slavery becomes kind of the symbol of the hypocrisy and the falsity of where the U.S. has gone in betrayal of what the founding was, or of what Mexican observers thought the founding was. I have a harder time getting a feel of what Mexicans think of the founding today. I think maybe it's kind of this myth that is in the background, but they don't grapple with it as much as, obviously, for reasons that are, natural, as Americans do.
Do you have a sense of how it's taught in schools, or the extent to which it's taught in schools?
It's taught in high school. Mexicans have public school children in Mexico get the same book. Everyone gets the same book, which is free, and the idea was, that would be the seed for home libraries, etc. So in high school, they do go over the American founding at the same time as the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution. So it is, I would say, taught in a very small dose. Factual, in general, positive.
I was struck by your discussion of a Mexican desire to work toward U.S. security needs after 1945. At the same time, flirting with third world or anti-American movements in the Americas and elsewhere. I'm wondering if you could speak more broadly about that, particularly given the U.S. Cold War interventionism in the Americas in that period.
So, yeah, Mexico has to navigate this thin line between collaboration with the U.S., which is central. No, a good relationship with the United States is absolutely central to Mexico, and they are very conscious of this. Living in, I'm picking up on the title of of an excellent book on U.S.-Mexican relations. They live in the shadow of a superpower. So are many things you cannot do. And to embrace what it sees as its role as a mid-size country with a revolutionary tradition and a leader among Latin American countries. So they will embrace multilateralism on one side and this special relationship with the U.S. On the other. So as, you know, a leader in principled, international law-driven efforts to construct a global order, Mexico will be very active in the UN. The Mexican diplomat, Alonso Garcia Robles, will collaborate with a Norwegian diplomat for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was signed in Tlatelolco in Mexico City. So a very active diplomacy. I take my hat off to our colleagues in the foreign ministry because they did all this with a very small budget. But this idea that Mexico should be a force for good, precisely because it kind of is able to balance the overbearing power of the U.S.
Sure. Could you say more about the role of Catholicism and the Catholic Church in U.S.-Mexican relations?
Okay, so it is a huge one because the role of the Catholic Church in Mexican history has been so large and so complicated. But I would say there is the active intervention of the American Catholic Church during the Cristero War, which is this armed conflict that breaks out against the revolution's anti-clerical laws in the 1920s. And it's a popular uprising of peasants in especially the western part of Mexico. And with a divided hierarchy, with the Pope thinking that this is very much not a good idea. And the American Church, and especially American Jesuits, kind of broker a peace that Mexican Cristeros find is a bit of a betrayal because they are not parties to the negotiations, but that puts an end to the violence. And it's very interesting. I don't know if he's still the Bishop of LA, he's a Mexican bishop. So I think that there is this realization with the Mexican, with Catholics, that nationality is perhaps not as important as belonging to the church. But I think there's a lot to be said that kind of would get us into the very nitty-gritty.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Along those lines, I was struck by your discussion of family and the way families straddle or in some ways erase the border. I'm wondering if you could talk about the different ways that families who have members on both sides of the border and have that shared trans-border history and experience, the way their views of the relationship between Mexico and the United States differ from people who don't have that experience, who are outside of that close familial relation.
Yeah, on one hand, with 11 million Mexicans in the US, and this is counting just born in Mexico, the Mexican government considers the children of Mexican citizens also Mexican, so that actually brings it up to like 26 or something. So many Mexican families have this experience of having someone on the other side. I think that in general, this has, it has built a transnational community that has very little to do with actual policies of status, of being documented or not, because these families keep in touch, these families exchange goods. Mexicans will visit their family in the US. The other way does not always happen because of undocumented status. Migrants introduced their Mexican hometowns to what was considered at one point very modern. One of the things is Mexican migrants who had worked in mining or in railroad building, et cetera, would go home dressed in overalls. And denim became the sign of modernity, instead of the white cotton manta that Mexican rural men would wear. So there is this construction of Mexican identity that has a lot to do with the US. Octavio Paz, who's Nobel laureate, the great Mexican poet, the great Mexican intellectual of the 60s and 70s, one of his reference points to talk about Mexican identity and this whole argument he has about our being very lonely and that's what defines us, so we wear masks, et cetera, is the Pachuco. And the Pachuco is the is the young Mexican American, the men who wore the zoot suits. And for him, that's like the quintessential lonely Mexican. So I think that the US plays a central part in how Mexican national identity has been thought about and written about.
A question from the audience. Could you speak to the role of indigenous people in Mexican history and the ways that might compare and contrast to indigenous people in the United States?
So I think Jay is going to have to invite me and I can give a course.
We have a lot of questions for you. I'm sorry.
Absolutely central. Mexican history was for a long time written with the indigenous population as the soul of the nation, its classical antiquity, et cetera. So the Indian of the past was glorified. The Indian of the present was, if not demeaned, considered, yes, the folk art is beautiful, yes, the languages are beautiful, but he needs to become a Mexican citizen. The revolution needs to engender a new man and a new woman, but usually they insisted on the new man. And that means not being an Indian anymore. So I think that is a very heavy legacy in terms of the majority of the population having indigenous and legacies, but the poorest Mexicans, you know how census, people who work with censuses have this, the typical, who is the typical Mexican? The poorest Mexican is a Mexican indigenous woman. So it's a history of on the one hand, exaltation in terms of identity and of discrimination and segregation and little opportunities.
Thank you. Speaking of history and the writing of history, you're a historian who works in both countries, both English and Spanish. I was wondering if I could give you a chance to comment on what that has meant to you and your development and trajectory as a historian.
Well, that I owe to my grandmother. No, that the fact that she always spoke to us in English meant that we didn't have to learn it, and that has been a really advantage in life. Fascinated by U.S. history. And I think that and I actually owe this to my American colleagues, is that when we started getting together with a sesquicentennial of the Civil War, the half quincentennial is easier than this sesquicentennial. I think U.S. Civil War historiography had really given the transnational turn, and they wanted to speak to people who were working on the same period in other areas of a very complicated decade of the 1860s, no? And it was actually my American colleagues who insisted that what was going on in Mexico was very relevant and that we should try to kind of put it on the table. When I started the book that came out in September, I thought it was going to be more of a comparative exercise. And what I came to realize with the research was that it was profoundly entangled, that you do miss a lot of things if you only look at one of the two nations. Mauricio Tenorio, who's a dear colleague at the University of Chicago, always says that you can't write the history of the US without writing the history of Mexico. And I think that's perhaps an exaggeration, but it is kind of writing, you can write the history of half the room, right? You can describe half the room and nothing, it's not fatal if you don't put in the other side of the room, but you do see things differently when you look at the whole room. And that, I think, is at certain points in history, that's the way the Mexican-US historical experience looks like. Not all the time, but at certain points in history, yes.
Did researching and writing that book change your view on Mexican history? Can you provide an example, maybe?
The fact that it is, and this, Emerson saw this, no? Emerson saw that the end of the outcome of the Mexican-American War would warp U.S. history. And Matias Romero insisted that this fight was the same fight. And I am convinced if the U.S. had not collapsed into civil war, there would have been no French intervention and there would have been no Second Empire. So yes, I think that it definitely, in that it turned, it made me realize that we don't look at the U.S. at our own peril.
So to reorient us toward the future, or the present,
Okay.
Out of that shared history, concurrent crisis, shared crisis of the mid-19th century, you spoke of this briefly at the end of your talk. Are there examples there or lessons there that we can look to guide us in this moment?
Okay, so big admirer of Matias Romero, and Matias Romero followed diplomatic rules and was the first foreign minister to visit President-elect Lincoln and told him that now we could, the Mexican liberals had defeated the horrible clerical conservatives and that Mexican-U.S. relations would now be based on mutual interest and free trade and things would go so much better and be very fraternal. And then the U.S. Civil War started, so that frustrated the whole thing. And there is this completely understandable insistence on neutrality, which is not only does the U.S. government insist on it, so does the Juarez government. And then Romero realized that he could get things done going around the administration and finding key political actors and working with them to get the results he wanted. And I think that we need to do that now. That there are a lot of things that within the Mexican-US relationship that are good for both nations, that need to be put on the table, that would allow for regulation, that would allow for transparency, that would protect those that are in a very precarious place because they are in the shadows of whatever the economy, and that we need to speak up, and we need to have this become institutionalized, and that to have this come from, and it's not necessarily below, but because some of these actors are very well placed, but we need to speak up and show that this can work, and it's not, we are not left to just the political discourse that has gained political traction through warping what the relationship has meant, who benefits from it, etc. These other actors have the facts. We need to bring them out.
Okay. Thank you. Professor Pani has given us a delightful talk, and I think that is a wonderful place to conclude. So please join me again in thanking our speaker.
And if anyone has a burning question that they couldn't get to, write to me. My email is in the website.
And I would add to check out her recent book, Torn Asunder, published in 2025 with the University of North Carolina Press, available at all good booksellers.
Exactly.
And she will be available now if you have additional questions. We have beverages in the back and on the side with, is there food? And there's food. Food and drinks. So thank you again, everyone. Thank you, Professor Pani.
you.